for the NFL Fantasy Crew. So we are going to talk through 10 prospects and where we think they'll land in the first round and what that fantasy impact means for this upcoming season. Let's start with the quarterback position and Joe Burrow, who I think was the dean of college football this last season. Rank, you guys both have Joe Burrow going to the Bengals in the first round. What does this mean for fantasy football?
Well, this is the most obvious pick. Obviously, it's going to help some of the guys that he's going to be playing with. We expect AJ Green to come back this season. Auden Tate was pretty good last year in a limited run. You got Tyler Boyd and some other options there in Cincinnati. So for those guys, I believe it's going to be pretty good. Joe Burrow comes to the NFL ready to go. He played in that offense with Joe Brady. So I think there will be games where he will be fantasy relevant, but he's going to probably be a high-end quarterback too for me.
All right, now let's move on to Tua. Again, you guys both have him going the fifth pick to the Miami Dolphins. Marcus, I want to start with you. Is Tua a good fit for the Dolphins? And what does this mean for fantasy football? Is this someone that people should target in dynasty leagues, someone that they should start this year?
Yeah, I think he's definitely more of a dynasty pick right now. I mean, Tua is a guy that you are drafting if you're the Miami Dolphins because he has upside, because your window to be competitive and to win a Super Bowl is a little bit longer than maybe some other teams, right? You are in a building process. You've got 3 picks in the first round. Why not take a guy in Tua who, when he is healthy and everything is right, has a little bit more mobility than some of the other quarterbacks in this draft, not named Jalen Hurts, for instance. So you put Tua in there, you build him, and maybe he's not the generational quarterback, but he's certainly a guy that you can put and kind of build around a little bit. So I think for a fantasy perspective, you're not really looking at him so much in redrafts, although there's certainly a chance he could get on the field this year. But in dynasty drafts, he's a guy that has a much longer runway to be productive. And I think that's where you're going to see the most value from him.
All right, what about Justin Herbert out of Oregon? Rank, you kind of have a spicy take and him falling late in the first round of the draft.
I don't think it's that spicy. I have the Chargers looking at Jordan Love because they need to make a big move. So swing for the fences, Chargers. That means that would allow Justin Herbert to fall down to the New England Patriots, which would actually be very good for fantasy. We've seen what the Patriots have done with quarterbacks over the years. They took pick 199 and turned him into the best quarterback of all time. They won games with Matt Castle, with Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, they would take Justin Herbert and make him a viable NFL quarterback, where if he went to Los Angeles, I think he'd be like, be all right. Like the Chargers had Drew Brees. You didn't do anything with them. So don't do this to Justin Herbert, who equated himself nicely at the end of his senior season. But I think that he's better off falling in the draft, going to New England. So that's where I put it. And I know a lot of you thought that was a crazy pick, but listen, that's what I do.
All right, Marcus, what about you?
Well, you can just call me Crayola because I'm going with the chalk right here, because I think Justin Herbert ends up in Los Angeles with the Chargers. Part of what really hamstrung them at the end of last season was Phillip Rivers and his quarterback play falling off a cliff. You put Justin Herbert in there, and he's certainly maybe not a Phillip Rivers type, but he's a guy who can certainly distribute the ball. They've got weapons there. Keenan Allen is still there. They just re-signed Hunter Henry. They've got Austin Eckler to catch the ball out of the backfield. Mike Williams had a fantastic year last year. I think he could potentially beat Tyrod Taylor in a quarterback competition. I think he's a guy who fits immediately, and I think he's sort of a high-end QB2 potential if he gets that starting job with the Bolts.
All right, I love it. Let's move on to the wide receivers. Now, this class of prospects is stacked, and analysts have said this from the very beginning, but I want to start out with CeeDee Lamb out of Oklahoma. Marcus, I want you to start us off this time.
All right, maybe I'm being all homerish and everything, but I have CeeDee Lamb dropping a couple of spots to 13 to the 49ers there. I mean, the Niners making a trade to get up to that 13th spot. So they've got 2 picks in the first round. So suddenly you put CeeDee Lamb in there. You pair him up with Deebo Samuel. You've got George Kittle. I know there's been a lot of things said about Jimmy Garoppolo and the way he finished the season, the way he played in the Super Bowl. But now you give him another consistent target to go to. You put him in Kyle Shanahan's creative offense. You move him around a little bit. CeeDee Lamb suddenly becomes a guy that we talk about rookie wide receivers potentially making a splash. CeeDee Lamb could be one of those guys in that San Francisco offense.
All right, Rank, what about you?
Well, I do believe the Jets will end up taking CeeDee Lamb. It makes sense to surround Sam Darnold with some additional wide receiver help. And you're like, well, they signed Brashard Perryman. I'm like, yes, they signed Brashard Perryman. This is not somebody of the caliber of CeeDee Lamb. So I think that he goes there. He becomes a superstar. The New York metropolitan area has a superstar wide receiver again. And it really helps out Sam Darnold, who actually started to play very well down the stretch last season. The Jets finished 7-9, which I know a lot of people, when you look back at it, you're like, how did they finish 7-9? But it didn't seem like it was going that well. So the Jets are probably going to make a commitment to helping out Sam Darnold with this pick. The way that I have done my predict the pick thing, I feel it's going to be CeeDee Lamb.
All right, what about Jerry Jeudy coming out of Alabama? This is another guy that you guys have both going at the same pick. Rank, you kick us off.
Well, I have him sort of going to the Raiders in this spot, because what I did in my mock draft that you can check out at NFL.com/rank, I was more of a consultant. I suggested the Raiders should call up the Green Bay Packers and say, listen, we'll give you this pick number 80. You send us Devontae Adams, and then everybody goes home happy. And I think that's a great thing. But if that doesn't happen, I still believe that if he does end up with the Las Vegas Raiders, Jerry Jeudy is going to end up as the number one receiver on that team. Hunter Renfrow obviously will be there catching some targets. Derek Carr loves to target his tight ends. They've added a couple this offseason, but ultimately you need that big play receiver. That's exactly what they wanted to do last season when they brought in Antonio Brown. We never obviously saw that come to fruition, but with Jerry Jeudy, and I believe at some point in the near future, we'll be arguing who is better, CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy. But I think that wherever he ends up, he's going to end up as a number one wide receiver. Las Vegas would be a perfect opportunity for him.
All right, moving on to T. Higgins out of Clemson. Rank, where do you see him going in the first round?
I love this player, so it's with a heavy heart as a Bears fan to see him go at pick number 22 to the Minnesota Vikings. They obviously have a need after they dealt away Stephon Diggs, and Higgins would be very good for them. He's one of those guys who can stretch the field, kind of take over that role that Stephon Diggs is leaving behind. Now, the big question is, where would he fall fantasy-wise? Now, last year, Stephon Diggs was the wide receiver 24. He finished behind guys like A.J. Brown and Michael Gallup. And as much as I love T. Higgins, I don't believe that he would walk in there and have a higher production value than them. So I would be looking at him as a low-end wide receiver 2, perhaps a high-end wide receiver 3 or a flex.
All right, Marcus, what about you?
Well, Bears fans, you're not going to like this too much either. I have him going number 30 to the Green Bay Packers. And we have been looking for the last couple of years for the Packers to add that wide receiver complement to Devontae Adams. We thought maybe it could be Geronimo Allison or Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and neither one of those guys really turned out to be the player that we thought they could be. Higgins is another guy who is a big body, who can go up and high point the football, who can get some separation, especially down the field. So when Aaron Rodgers throws those back foot Hail Marys that he is prone to do occasionally, maybe he has a guy now that can come down with him a little bit. I think because of the potential of what he could be in that offense, like we still are desirous of having another wide receiver there in Green Bay to draft. It's what caused us to reach for, as I mentioned, Allison and MVS. I think we'll start to maybe reach a little bit for T. Higgins, try to project him as a wide receiver 3. And if everything works out, maybe he hits that mark. But I think that's sort of where we're looking at his ceiling right now.
Now, moving on to Henry Ruggs. This is a guy that you guys both agree is going to go number 15 to the Denver Broncos. The Broncos got Melvin Gordon in free agency. They have Cortland Sutton, Noah Fant, some other guys. Is Henry Ruggs automatically fantasy relevant? Marcus, what do you think?
I think so, especially in Denver there. I mean, we saw what Cortland Sutton did last year. They seem to have pinned their hopes right now on Drew Lock. Ruggs has blazing speed. That is the first and foremost thing that you notice about him, that you talk about with him. But he can do a lot of things very effectively in that offense. And we talk about, Joe Burrow seems pretty much faded to the Bengals at the top of the draft. Henry Ruggs to the Broncos seems pretty much just as much faded as some of these other picks we talk about. So I think as long as he's there, and he turns out to be the guy we think he is, I think he does have some nice flex appeal in a lot of fantasy leagues.
All right, this is another guy that you guys have both going at the same pick. Rank, I want to start with you, Justin Jefferson out of LSU. Give me your take.
I love this pick. And as a matter of fact, if he does end up going to the Philadelphia Eagles, and I know a lot of the Eagles fans are like, why can't we get Ruggs? Don't move up. Don't do anything rash. Don't, because if you end up with Jefferson, this player for this team could end up being the most productive rookie in fantasy this season. He's pro ready. He's going to come in. He's played in that offense. He played in a sophisticated offense with Joe Brady, who's the new offensive coordinator with the Carolina Panthers. So he's going to come in day one and be ready to go. So I love this. I love this spot for him. I love this pick for him. I love his route. I love everything about this. So if Jefferson goes to the Eagles, that is the top player in redraft leagues who I would pick wide receiver wise.
All right, what about LaVisha Chenault coming out of Colorado? Marcus, where do you have him going?
I've got him going number 25 to the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, I know, Rank, you had the Vikings taking a wide receiver. I've got a different one here. He was a guy that in Boulder was a do-everything guy for the Buffaloes, right? I mean, they lined him up in different spots as a wide receiver. They would occasionally put him in the backfield and use him to run the football as well. I think he's incredibly versatile, maybe a little bit underrated just because the Pac-12 as a whole doesn't quite get the national love that some of the other conferences do. But I think for a team that is looking to replace Stephon Diggs and looking for some help for Adam Thielen, Shenaults can step in there and kind of be a little bit of a jack of all trades in this passing game. I think he's a guy that you can put him in the slot if you need to. You can put him out wide. His speed will allow him to get some separation. I think he's a good route runner with consistent hands. I think he can go in there and look. I think he's sort of in the mid range when you're talking about your rookie draft picks, your dynasty picks there. But I think he's a guy who has a high ceiling, especially in an offense that can figure out how to use him properly.
I believe that he's the best athlete in the draft, at least from the wide receiver position. I agree with Marcus and all of that. The only thing is I believe that he would be wasted in Minnesota. They're not creative enough. And I think there's only a handful of teams that will get the most out of them. One of them being the New Orleans Saints, who I have selecting him. If he doesn't go to New Orleans, I hope he goes to San Francisco, because one of the things you're going to be able to do with him during his rookie season is just like go out, run down the field. We're going to throw you a deep ball. We'll run a couple of jet sweeps. And I believe that bringing him into a team like New Orleans that already has Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, they signed Emmanuel Sanders during the offseason. He is a player that'll come in, be an immediate fan favorite. He'll vulture some touchdowns. It'll be frustrating from a fantasy perspective because you'll never be able to know when you can trust him. But I think from a pure football situation of where he could go, where he will do his best, I love him going to the New Orleans Saints because I think it's Sean Payton, and they don't really have a lot of needs. So they can kind of play fast and loose here and do something that a lot of teams that are like pinned into like, we need to draft a cornerback or we need to take a defensive tackle. The Saints are kind of playing with house money, and they're like, we're going to take him. We're going to use him as a gadget type player, and everybody's going to love him.
All right, I love that. Now, let's go on to the running back position. DeAndre Swift coming out of the University of Georgia. Marcus, kicking it off with you. Where do you predict he will land in the first round?
I've got him at the very last pick of the first round, 32 to the Kansas City Chiefs. It's going to just be adding to an embarrassment of riches they already have in that offense. DeAndre Swift is a guy who can do a little bit of everything. I think he catches the ball well out of the backfield. He's a guy that on RPOs is potentially deadly. So suddenly, as dangerous as Patrick Mahomes is back there, and look, we saw Mahomes run the football very well for the Chiefs in the playoffs. You start putting him in some RPO situations with DeAndre Swift. Suddenly, linebackers are frozen in their place. That opens things up and makes him even more deadly throwing the ball to guys like Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill at all. So DeAndre Swift, you put him there in that Chiefs offense, an offense that was already very good, might become nearly unstoppable once they have that threat at running back.
They have that with DeAndre Washington now, the GOAT himself. They're amazing. They're all set. I do love that pick. I do think that the Kansas City Chiefs could be looking at a running back, but I looked at pick, I think it is 28 with the Baltimore Ravens. And in my mock draft, I had them taking DeAndre Swift, which upset Ravens fans across the world, mostly because Kenneth Murray was still on the board. And they're like, we should go for a linebacker. We don't need a running back. But to me, if Swift falls to the spot where the Ravens are picking and they look at Mark Ingram, who is 30 years old, and Gus Edwards is fine. But if you can add a player of the caliber of DeAndre Swift, when you have an opportunity to be a Super Bowl caliber team and you bring in a player like DeAndre Swift, this to me would be so automatic. He makes them better. Their defense is already good. I believe that he would take their offense to the next level. I think at some point he would usurp Gus Edwards, obviously. And I believe he would start pushing Mark Ingram for carries. So I think that if the Ravens have the foresight, and they did when they took Lamar Jackson, they knew what they were doing. They've got a short window. This is a player that can help them win now, and it can help them win in your fantasy leagues.
Daniel Jeremiah used to work for the Ravens. Maybe he can put in a reference.
Make a call. Yeah. Cool. Could live in Baltimore. That'd be sick.
All right, well, if you fans want to see both Marcus and Rink's full picks, you can head over to Twitter and check their Predict the Pick entries. But as a reminder, go to NFL.com and fill out your entry to win a chance to go to Super Bowl 55 in Tampa, Florida. And make sure, if you have any fantasy needs, you follow us at NFL Fantasy and like and subscribe down below. Thanks, guys.